In my early 20s, I was employed at a large printing company and I worked in the digital printing department. Every few months, we'd get a massive job that required us to work around the clock for several days. One night, we were working late and we were getting low on stock, so I had to go grab a pallet from the warehouse. I checked the spot where it normally is, but it was empty. This meant I had to go down in the basement where we kept the overflow. I secretly hated going in the basement because it was really creepy. It was an old building and the basement just had a spooky vibe to it, especially at night when a lot of the lights were off. If you needed to bring a pallet up, you had to use this rickety old freight elevator that looked like it was straight out of a Saw movie or something. It was close to 3 a.m. and there were only 3 of us left in the building. Everyone else left at midnight. My 2 coworkers had to stay in our area and keep the printers running, so I grabbed a pallet jack and got in the elevator. As expected, most of the lights were out downstairs. The switches were scattered around, so you couldn't just turn all the lights on at once. I turned on the ones I needed, which weren't too far from the elevator. Most of the basement was just rows of tall shelving or steel cabinets. I took the pallet jack and started walking several aisles down to get the stock. The pallet jack was pretty noisy as I walked, but after a few seconds, I thought I heard something, so I stopped. I wasn't sure, but it kind of sounded like someone humming or something. I didn't hear it anymore, so I started walking again. Then it started again, but this time it sounded more like someone whistling. I stopped again, but I didn't hear it anymore. I started walking again, but this time I thought I heard someone say, "Hey." By now, I assumed that my coworkers were messing with me. I kept walking just a little further until I got to the row I was looking for. I pushed the jack under the pallet, and when I started pumping it up, I could hear someone go, "Psst." I knew for sure now that my coworkers were messing with me, so I called out, "Okay, good one, guys. You got me. You can come out now." But no one responded. I thought to myself, wow, they're really keeping it going. Then I heard someone whisper, "Psst, over here." It sounded like it came from my left where it was pretty dark. All I could see were rows of cabinets. I heard someone say it again. I thought if Mark and Todd were going to mess with me, then I'd try to do something back. I had some change in my pocket and I took it out and started tossing coins in that direction. I threw 2 and I heard them hit the cabinets and then fall to the floor. When I went to throw the third, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw someone's head just barely pop up behind a cabinet to my right. As I turned to look, they ducked down pretty quickly. It was dark over there too, so I couldn't really tell exactly who it was. But I turned and threw a couple coins in that direction too. I then crouched down and ran to the end of the row as quietly as I could to try to sneak up on them. I ran past several rows but still didn't see anyone when I looked down each one. I got to the corner and looked down the last row, and just as I did, I could barely see someone turn the corner at the other end. I sprinted to catch up. I could hear 2 sets of footsteps in the distance, and as I got to the end of the row, all the lights went out. Even though I knew they were messing with me, I'll admit I was pretty scared and I didn't want to be down there in the dark. I quickly pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and ran to the nearest staircase about 25 feet away. I sprinted up the stairs and ran back to our area, which wasn't too far once you got back upstairs. I pushed the doors open expecting to beat Mark and Todd back to the department, but they were in there, loading paper in the printer trays. This didn't make any sense. They would have had to take the slow elevator or the only other staircase, which is on the other end of the building. Even being a little ahead of me, they still would have had to make it back through either a giant press room or the front office. There's no way they'd be able to do that. They looked over as I was catching my breath and I asked, "How did you guys beat me back here?" They looked confused and asked what I was talking about. I said, "I know you guys were messing with me downstairs, but how did you make it back up here before I did?" Mark replied, "We've been up here the whole time, what do you mean?" I was still catching my breath and I noticed that neither of them were breathing hard at all, not even a little bit. I started to get that unsettling feeling in my gut when I asked, "Wait, are you serious?" They swore they never left the room, and I was starting to believe them. I told them what happened and they maintained their story. I told them we should call the cops, thinking that they would finally fess up when I pulled out my phone to make the call, but they didn't. They agreed that I should. They didn't want to be in there if there were some intruders in the building, so I did. The police showed up a few minutes later and we walked all around both floors of the building making sure no one was in there. We didn't find anyone or see any signs that anyone had broken in. The police left and we finished our shift. We explained everything to our boss when he came in at 6 a.m. It was a hot topic around work for a few days, but nothing further ever happened. I don't know who or what I encountered in the basement that night, but I never went down there alone again. When I got out of college, I took a part-time job working as a graphic designer for a small printing company in my hometown. There were 5 of us total that worked there, including the owner. We mostly dealt with other businesses in the area, and we sold office supplies and furniture as well. Sometimes we'd have to install the furniture and I'd have to go help out. I don't mean like assembling mass-produced computer desks. We'd custom design this stuff for the clients. Sometimes we'd assemble a single desk, and other times we'd be installing like 12 cubicles at a car dealership or something. One day I had to go along on a job, and it was usually just me and Bill, who was in charge of the installs. We were installing 2 workstations for the office manager at a housing complex. It was this old brick building that must have had 10 or 12 floors. We pulled up near the front entrance and went inside. We found the office manager, who instructed us to park around the corner and she would give us access to a side door. Once inside, the office area was separated from the lobby and locked so none of the tenants could get back there. I remember that as soon as I walked into the building, you were hit with this almost unbearable smell. I don't even know how to describe it. It was sort of like this really sour BO, but it was unlike anything I've ever smelled before. We were carrying some things in and out, and I asked Bill what the smell was. He just kind of chuckled and said, "Well, in this sort of complex, a lot of the residents don't exactly have the best hygiene." We finished bringing in our stuff, and then the manager showed us where the 2 desks would be going. She said they were for her and her assistant, and then said if we didn't have any questions, she'd be back in about an hour. Bill and I got started and made quick work of the first desk. We started on the second, and we ran out of screws right away. Bill said he'd run outside and get another box. I heard his phone ring as he walked out the door, and I heard him answer it. I couldn't really do anything until he came back, so I just sat there looking around, and I checked my phone quick. About 30 seconds went by, and I thought I heard a woman talking quietly in the hallway. I walked over and peeked my head out the doorway, but it stopped. I stepped back inside the office and I could hear it again. I thought maybe the manager was back and talking to someone in the other room. I looked out again but saw nothing and the voice stopped. By this time, a couple minutes went by and Bill still hadn't returned. I was quickly growing impatient. I mean, that funky smell was just crazy. I walked down the hall and opened the door to look outside. Bill was standing by the van, still talking on the phone. He motioned with his hand to give him a minute, and he tossed me a box of screws. I went back inside to keep working. I just wanted to get the job done as quickly as possible. I crawled under the desk to start screwing the cabinet to the top. When I pulled the trigger of the drill, I heard a loud banging sound. I stopped and popped my head out from under the desk. To my surprise, I saw a woman standing in the doorway, but it wasn't the manager. It was an older woman wearing what looked to be an old nurse's uniform from the 1950s or something. She just stared at me with a blank face. I felt a little creeped out and after a second or two muttered, hello. She just kept looking at me for a few seconds and then softly said, "You should go now." Or at least that's what I thought I heard. She turned around and walked down the hall. I was confused and thought maybe it was the assistant and there was some kind of problem or something. I got up and walked down the hall to ask the woman about it. There was only one other room down the hallway and it was a big storage room with filing cabinets and stuff. I looked around but didn't see anyone. At the end of the hall was the door to the lobby, which was apparently locked on the other side. On my side was one of those metal bars you had to push to unlatch it. Those are usually pretty loud and I know I didn't hear it, or a door shut for that matter. I was feeling rather confused by this point and turned around and walked to the other end. I opened the door going outside again and saw Bill closing the van door and walking back inside. I asked him if he saw a woman go in or out. He told me no. I think he saw the look of confusion on my face and asked why. I told him what happened, but he just sort of brushed it off and said, "Yeah, I don't know, I didn't see anyone." We finished assembling the desk and I decided it must have just been the assistant or something. We started cleaning up our tools and stuff when the office manager returned. She seemed really happy with the desks and said, "I'm really excited. My new assistant starts on Monday." Hearing this sort of shocked me a little. I said, "Wait, your assistant didn't start yet? Well, then who was the woman that I saw in here earlier?" Her eyes kind of squinted and she said, "What woman?" I told her there was a woman in an old nurse uniform that told me I should leave or something like that. She nodded her head and said, "Oh, yeah. That was probably Mary. She likes to visit us once in a while." I was relieved, thinking that one of the tenants comes into the office sometimes. And she said, "Hold on," and she walked out of the room. A few moments later, she came back with an old framed black and white photo. You could clearly tell that it was a really old photograph, and it was of a big group of people who were obviously posing for the picture. Kind of like a sports team you'd see in a yearbook or something. She pointed to one of the women in the photo, who was wearing a similar uniform and looked just like the woman I had seen. She asked, "Was it her?" Confused, I responded, "Yes, who was that?" She then explained to me that the building was the original hospital in town that opened in the early 1900s and closed in the late 70s. I remember hearing the name of the old hospital before, but didn't realize that this was the same building. She said that Mary was one of the nurses there and she apparently died in the building. She then said, "Yeah, most of the time we just hear noises or a light flickering, but sometimes people say they see her." A chill ran down my spine as I realized she was talking about a ghost. I think she saw the freaked out look on my face as she grabbed my shoulder and said, "Don't worry, she's harmless and we're used to her by now." Still in shock, I mumbled something like, "Oh, okay." She thanked us again for the job and we gathered our stuff and left. Bill and I talked about how crazy that was on the way back to the office. I got a different job a few months later, but to this day, I think about that every time I drive by that building. Years ago, I worked at a big printing company. I worked second shift in the pre-press department with 4 other people. Our department was towards the front of the building and was divided into 3 areas. There was the computer room, which was the main room, the plate room, and the printing room. My primary job was to make printing plates, and when I was done, I'd have to go help out Rick and Steve, who worked in the printing room. They were always really busy. It was around 7 or 8 p.m. and I went over to help Rick and Steve. Most of the front office staff was usually gone by this point. There was a decent-sized crew out on the shop floor running the presses and the binder equipment, but this area was further away, so you didn't really see these folks up front very often. Rick was out on the floor using the cutter, so I was helping Steve in the print room. Rick and Steve were both around my age, and we all got along really well. I'd even been over to Steve's apartment a couple times. He was one of these guys that would always have a new hobby that he was almost overly excited about. He would get kind of obsessed with something, and that's all he would talk about for several weeks. But then his excitement would fade, and he'd find something new, and the cycle would start over. For example, he got really into weightlifting for a couple months, and then all he was talking about was video editing for a while. Well, for a few months leading up to this, he started getting really into firearms. He was always talking about them, and would show me pictures of some guns he bought, or show me pictures of paper targets that he shot at the range. Being a gun owner myself, I didn't mind these conversations, but he was always way more excited than I was. A couple weeks into this, he also told me that he took the class to get his concealed pistol license. So going back to this night at work, him and I were talking and he said, "Hey, check it out, I got my CPL in the mail yesterday." I assumed he was going to pull out his wallet and show me the actual license, but instead he lifted the bottom of his shirt and showed me the pistol he had in his waistband. Now, I want to say that this may sound strange to some people, but I wasn't threatened by this at all. The vast majority of gun owners that I've come across are good people who are simply trying to protect themselves and their families. Also, I'd worked with this guy for a couple years now, and I always thought he was a straight shooter, no pun intended. I could tell he was just really excited about it. However, I did immediately think that him showing me was a very poor judgment call, considering that if you have a CPL, you're not supposed to show or tell anyone about it unless you're in a situation where you're in fear for your life. So, he dropped his shirt back down and we continued talking while we worked. A few minutes later, he left the room and said he would be back in a few minutes. I kept working for close to an hour when I ran into a problem with the machine, and I needed his help to fix it. I looked around the room and realized I hadn't seen him since he said he'd be right back. I walked out and went over to the computer room where I could see everything through some big windows. All I saw was Jeff sitting at his desk working, so I didn't bother walking in. I then walked out to the shop floor to see if he was using the cutter, but it was just Rick out there. I asked if he'd seen Steve, but he said no. I looked around the entire shop floor to see if he was maybe talking to someone out there, but I still didn't see him. I kept walking around and even checked the bathroom, but there was no one in there. I kept walking through the shop and made it into the warehouse area where the back door to the building is. This is where all the second shifters park. I opened the door and looked into the parking lot and I didn't see his car. I was getting pretty annoyed at this point. I thought maybe he snuck off to lunch without telling anyone, and now I needed his help. I walked back to the computer room and I saw Jeff sitting there with this weird look on his face. I asked him if he knew where Steve went and I told him that his car was gone. He said, "No, but there's a situation." He showed Christy his gun and she freaked out. Christy worked in our department too, and I already knew she would absolutely not be okay with someone having a gun at work, regardless if they had good intentions or not. Jeff told me that she went and reported it to the sales manager, James, who was still in the front office working. I told Jeff that he showed me too, but it didn't really bother me. Jeff said that he showed him as well. He said that he had the same reaction I did. He didn't really care, but he thought it was extremely stupid to be walking around showing people. A few minutes later, James and Christy came into the room. Christy was visibly very upset, which was understandable. James told us that he called the police and they should be here shortly, and that we were going to be locking the building down. He started to ask questions like, "Does anyone know where he is? Has anyone seen him?" I told him I was looking for him before I knew what was going on, and that I didn't see his car in the parking lot anymore. We assumed that once he knew he was going to be in trouble, that he probably left the building. Christy had this fear that he was going to shoot up the place or something. Jeff and I really didn't think that he had ill intentions at all, but here's where it gets sketchy. When all this was happening, Christy had left her phone at her desk. While we were waiting for the police to arrive, she realized that she had 3 missed calls from Steve, and he left her 2 voicemails. She was really scared, but we decided to listen to the voicemails on speaker while we waited. The first one was about 30 seconds long. It was mostly just muffled white noise, but towards the end it sounded like you could hear someone breathing for a few seconds. It was really hard to make out, but then it sounded like someone whispered, "I know you said something," and then it ended. The second one also had the muffled white noise, and then you could hear a distinct metallic sound. It was faint, but Jeff and I both thought it sounded like someone racking the slide of a pistol. We were all uneasy after this, to say the least. I really wanted to give the guy the benefit of the doubt, that he was just overly excited about his new hobby and made a terrible choice to show people. But the voicemails changed my mind on the whole thing, and I was feeling a bit scared myself now. The police showed up and took statements from all of us. They listened to the voicemails several times over. They thought it was really hard to tell because the recording was so muffled, but the fact that he even called her at all was very questionable. They told us that they would definitely be going over to Steve's house to question him. I never saw him again after that day. He was obviously fired that night. The next day, the doors were locked when I came into work. I had to be let in the building by someone, and a couple weeks later they installed locks where you had to badge in. Shortly after I arrived, they had a meeting with everyone. The president briefly mentioned the incident, and he went on to say that firearms were not allowed on company property, even if you had a license to carry one. He mentioned a police investigation, but he said he couldn't give any details at that time. I think we all felt a little uneasy at work for a few weeks after that, but thankfully nothing else ever happened.